present and turn on your camera if you are in the room with us today. Your camera, doesn't matter what you're doing. If you look bored, if you look discombobulated and a mess, I don't really care. Like, nobody has to look beautiful for Zoom. So anyway, today is the first thing I wanted to talk about today. There were two things I wanted to talk about today. One thing that I wanted to talk about is Orange Shirt Day is coming up, and that is September 30th when we commemorate the victims of the residential school system. So to do this, we wear an orange shirt. There is a story behind this. I should send the story to everybody so it makes a little more sense, but you could decide for yourself, obviously, if you want to or don't want to wear an orange shirt. If you don't have an orange shirt, you can make an orange background, but maybe this will make more sense when I send the story to everyone. So I'll try to remember to do that later today. Step one, I got to write that down if I got to remember it. So let's see, orange shirt story. My next question is anyone presenting today? Does anyone have a presentation? Sydney has a presentation today. So Sydney, I'm gonna make you co-host. So when we get to that, you're gonna have a chance to do that. So you are now my co-host. Lucky you, you've got all the power now to control everything. So that's the next important thing I had to cover today. So we'll be looking at that probably after the David Eagleman video. We'll finish the video, then we'll do Sydney's presentation. So that's number two. Number three that I wanted to mention before we start the video is, I don't know if you noticed, but the quiz number 1 grades were back for this class. So hopefully you saw how you did. It should have emailed you the results. Did you get an email with the results from the quiz, like the feedback or anything like that? You just got a grade so far? Okay, so from Class Marker, it's supposed to email you. I think you can access the quiz to see your results or to see, you know, if you got something wrong, what you got wrong. So I think that's important to look at before the next exam is upon us. And that is because we're probably gonna have another online exam from the way things are going. In fact, I sent an email to my department chair to ask if I can give all my exams online, because I don't want people taking the public transit, if they take public transit, or like, especially since Montreal is going to the red alert soon. So hopefully the next exam I'll get permission and it can be, I'll get permission and we'll have our exams on online. So for Class Marker, definitely going through this was a little bit of an experience for me. So hopefully the next time it'll be a little smoother. Some things will be a little bit more clear. If anything was not clear to you about it, like it's sort of like going through it, you get better at giving tests of that nature. So designing the questions, making sure you don't give the same question twice to people as a random question, but it'll probably work in a similar way. There'll be like randomized questions that you get for the exam. There will be some kind of essay question, possibly 2 essay questions. So that's just to keep in mind, it'll probably be similar in its makeup, but hopefully the questions will be a little bit more. It took a really long time to grade, much longer than a paper test. So that was also very interesting for me. The other thing I wanted to mention was if you haven't started reading it and you haven't got your hands on it yet, where is my copy of the book? On my desk somewhere, but you should begin reading Lucretius, The Nature of Things, chapters 1, 2, and 3. We're going to talk about the brain probably in this class and the next, but after that we'll be starting to look at Lucretius, which is an ancient author situated. He's a Roman writer taking Greek ideas, introducing them to the Romans. So he's a really bridges the gap between different things. And so he's pretty cool. And he writes about science, or what we think of as the roots of science, the idea that everything is made up of atoms and void. Atoms, the word atom, literally means atom. It means not cuttable in ancient Greek. A means not, and tom means to cut. So the smallest imaginable particle is the atom. Everything is made up of these atoms and void. And as you read it, you'll find out he thinks atoms have different shapes and different properties that kind of come with these atoms or combinations of atoms. It's very interesting, although today we might use the word elements and we might use, we think about things in a different way, but you could see the roots of scientific thinking in Lucretius. And of course, in chapter 3, that is when he begins to talk about what makes up the human, what makes a person unique as an individual. He talks about temperament. He talks about how people are made of a soul and a spirit. So for this, I'm going to post reading guides. So I got to make sure I do that too. So I'm going to write that down. All these things I got to get done after class. And these reading guides, they're very general in the sense that they cover a lot of material in the book. They're very thorough. What I mean to say is they're very thorough. Like they cover lots of stuff that I may not talk about in this class. Some of the more religious aspects of the book, for example, or philosophical, because they were designed for, I don't know, they were designed I wrote them up at a different time when I taught the class a little bit differently. But I think they really guide you through the text. Now, why do I give you reading guides? Because it isn't the easiest book to read. To begin with, unlike a science textbook, which is, very factual with problems and examples, this is a poem. It's written as poetry. So take your biology book, your chemistry book, your physics book, and imagine it as poetry. And imagine it making metaphors and references to all sorts of things. And you'll get a sense of what kind of makes Lucretius a little bit challenging. So it's poetry. It's obviously very much a part of the world in which Lucretius lives. It deals with things like gods and philosophy, and he spends a lot of time arguing against theories he doesn't believe in. In Greek philosophy and in philosophy, there were different arguments about what made up all things. Is everything made up of water, or is everything made up of 4 basic elements, or is everything made up of numbers like the Pythagoreans thought? And Lucretius takes the perspective that everything is made up of atoms and void. So he argues against what other people have said. So he spends some time disproving other theories. And unless you know those theories, his arguments seem a little out there. They seem a little wordy and long and like, why is he talking about this? You just have to be aware that he's arguing against other points of view. He's trying to defend his perspective against other perspectives, which is kind of neat because then you can learn about the other perspectives from him. And the other thing that makes this a bit of a challenge is that it's really steeped in the philosophy of Epicurus. I'm going to write that name down, Epicurus, who is a Greek philosopher who held beliefs about how you should live your life, what you should be concerned with in life. And we'll talk about Epicurus quite a bit in this class because it's important to understand Epicurus to get an idea of what Lucretius is talking about. But Lucretius himself is one of our best surviving Epicurean philosophers. So we learn a lot about Epicurus from Lucretius, but he's kind of taking someone else's arguments and ideas, and that's the lens that he uses, why he cares so much about atoms and void making up all things. So you'll get the reading guides. I'll get those up. I tell you, just finish reading this before the exam. So that's what's important, but I'll actually, based on how far we get in this class, that's where I'll be like, read up to this point in the book. It might be somewhere in chapter 3 and it might be somewhere in chapter 2. I'm not sure because we're about a class and a half behind or something like that. So I'm not exactly how sure I'll get through Epicurus, but I do want to cover the brain thoroughly for this class because it's an important part of this class. And then we'll move on to Lucretius. So that's what's coming, just so you know what's coming down the road. So I would start reading. It's more helpful if you've read it through once and then you get to hear about it and then you can re-look at it and it'll make even more sense the next time around. So that's my beginning opening remarks for the day. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I checked on class marker. I just checked it, but I didn't get any result back.
Okay, so I will figure that out. Like, I have to fiddle around with it to send you
Okay,
the
thank you.
results. But I want you to be able to see like what because I wrote feedback and stuff. And if I'm writing all this feedback, I want you to be able to read the feedback. So the grade is not in a vacuum. You'll know why you got the grade you got. So I will work on that today and try and get that back to you. I thought I had it emailed to you, but I guess not. So I'll find out. Any other questions? All right. So David Eagleman. So where we left off, thanks to people have told me. So we were watching this. We're watching the David Eagleman film, and in the last part, he talked about someone whose brain had been affected by a tumor that was pressing on his amygdala. And although we can't be certain exactly what caused Charles Whitman to act in a violent way, to shoot people indiscriminately at the University of Texas, to kill his wife and to kill his mother, there's a good reason to believe that this part of the brain that specializes in fear and aggression was affected by this, this growth in his brain. So injuries and disease do cause changes to our personalities and can change who we are and how we interact with others. David Eagleman had also mentioned several diseases that could change how we are and how we interact with others. Can anyone name any or remember what he mentioned in the film?
Like, for example, like for Parkinson's, especially like the medicine, like the yeah, medicine they have to take, so that alters their brain.
Okay, so I wrote a few
Sorry.
words in the chat. So yeah, so if you have Parkinson's disease, first of all, Parkinson's disease can impact your personality. But the treatment for Parkinson's, which acts with parts of the brain, the medicine in particular, what's it called? It makes you less inhibited. So it works with your inhibitions. And people who take Parkinson's medicine sometimes develop conditions that reflect this loss of inhibition. So they might become compulsive about gambling, or they become indiscriminate about sex partners, even if they've been married for like 40 years and loyal to one person. Suddenly this is, their brain has changed and their behaviors change to follow that. Or they start, there's all these stories about like what people wear, they go outside naked, their inhibitions are gone. So you could be impacted by everything that you do, but some things are more extreme than others. Any changes to your brain could in turn affect your behaviors, possibly your beliefs, your sense of self. And these changes are not necessarily changes you intend. It's not like you're deliberately practicing a musical piece and that's changing your ability to memorize stuff, because memory is something you want to improve as you're practicing music, let's say. These are unintentional changes that come about as well. Now, the next thing that David Eagleman is going to talk about will be memory. And what's so interesting about memory is that we often think of, well, memory is the story of me. It's what tells me who I am. But memory is a lot more complicated than that, as I think you will see from the video. So I'm going to stop recording because YouTube cuts it out, but I rather just stop it myself. So I'm going to stop it now and we're going to begin the video. So her studies have been very influential in looking at eyewitness accounts, for example. That was one of her big things, was kind of making eyewitness accounts something that we no longer necessarily can rely on in court cases. What did she find in particular about memory involving when people were shown images of car crashes, for example?
Depending on the vocabulary that was used in the questions, their answers would be different.
Okay, so even though people saw the exact same video and should have, in theory, the exact same memory of what they saw, depending on the question they were asked, they remembered the videos differently. So this is why when, let's say, someone has been sexually assaulted, or and they're asking questions about the incident, the people asking questions are supposed to have very specific training so that they don't cause the memories to be affected, the memory to be affected of these things. So there's this really interesting phenomena. And of course, with eyewitness accounts on the stand, the kinds of questions that are asked might cause people to recount their memories differently. So memory can be influenced by the language that's used to kind of activate them or retrieve them, for example. But she found something else very interesting about memory that is surprising, that involves implanted memories. What did she find out about, or what are implanted memories, and what did she discover?
Well, people, she gave like people some like false scenarios about their childhood, and she found out that like they can make false memories, and people actually embrace that false memories and come up with like new memories of their own based on that false memory.
Exactly. So people, they're told a series of like true memories and then one false memory. And a certain percentage of people, in fact, will take that false memory, believe it is their own memory, and not only will they remember it as if it's their own, they will embellish the story and add to it. They'll remember more details from a memory that never happened. So people, in fact, their memories can be entirely not of real things that have happened. That might be interesting to think about if you're thinking about reality, of course, as you proceed into the reality paper. So memories can be made of events that never transpired at all. And Elizabeth Loftus herself, experienced that with the death of her mother. The last part of the memory thing that I think, of course, that he talks about is patient HM, or Henry Molaison. Patient HM, or Henry Molaison. I'm writing that in the chat for you. He's a very famous study. In fact, one of the people who worked on him was like a McGill professor, which I think is kind of interesting, or she eventually became someone associated with McGill, at any rate, was one of the people who was involved in kind of working with him through his lifetime. So Henry Molaison had epileptic seizures that had gotten so bad, they, potential to cause brain damage, they were interfering with his life. So the decision was made to remove part of his brain to deal with the seizures, his hippocampus on both sides of his brain. So it's in the video, they may have said they removed the whole thing, but I think they removed 2/3 of it, or whatever it is. They removed it on both sides. In fact, they may have removed more than his hippocampus. And on one hand, it worked for the seizures. He stopped having the seizures. But on the other hand, it affected something else about Henry Molaison. And I don't know if someone is presenting on him, because there's been a lot of research done on him. He's died, which is why instead of being called patient HM, we're able to say his name, Henry Molaison. There's been a lot of work on Henry Molaison since his, during his lifetime and his death, that revealed things about memory. What did they find out about Henry Molaison when they removed his hippocampus? What couldn't he do?
He couldn't predict things in the future because
So
it was
one of the Yeah, one of the very important things he couldn't do was predict things in the future. So the finding I was actually looking for, which came from Christopher, thank you, was that he couldn't form long-term memories. He could remember things in the short term, like 5 questions or something like that. He could remember speaking to you. He could remember some things from his past. But when it came to forming a new long-term memory, that existed past an hour or existed past 2 hours or a day, he couldn't do that anymore. So he was unable to form new long-term memories. Studies about him have been a little more complex than that, but we'll just go with what the video said for now. But the other thing that was noticed is that he couldn't predict what would happen in the future, which reveals something about how memories get used. So even though they're flawed and they could be implanted and they fade with time, memories serve a very useful purpose. And what is that? What do you think I'm getting at? What is that purpose of memories in regards to predicting the future?
Well, you take what was good from your past actions and you try to recreate them, I guess, and what you associate like bad things with, you try and stop doing them in the future.
Okay, so memory is very actively involved in making decisions about the future based on the experiences that we've had in the past. So memory is super important in future prediction, as Henry Molaison shows us. I think that's super cool. So I'm going to continue with the video because I realize we've got quite a bit to get through still, and I got to keep showing it. So I'm going to stop recording. We're going to go back to the video, and hopefully it won't break up again. All right, let's get back to recording. Okay. So, one of the things, the next section that he talks about is another what I like about this video, it's hitting on some of the most influential studies of really the past few decades. So the Nun study, and it's one that still goes on, is a longevity study. So I'll write that in the side. Oops, in case you, everyone, let's send that to everybody, a longevity study. So the goal of this study, of course, is to look at people over a period of time, and it reveals something about the maintenance of oneself over time, like trying to keep your brain healthy. So again, someone might be presenting on this in class, and in fact, I think what I've made it about is a related study. It isn't specifically this one about the Alzheimer's and the brain health disease, but another thing. But in this particular study of the nuns, and there are some brothers that are being studied as well. So they live in similar environments, they have like similar diets, they're all around the same age. So there's a lot of factors that are similar to them. And they do tests, every year to test their mental, health and their physical health. And then when they die, they're doing autopsies on their brains to see, what can be learned from the recordings of how their life was, from how their brains appear after death. And the findings were striking because their brains showed the signs of having Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease, I'm writing it in the chat, disease, is a degenerative disease where the brain tissue develops these plaques and tangles. So supposedly it doesn't function the way it should. It may get necrotic, like it dies, some of it as well, I believe. So that's what happens to your brain, is that portions of it are essentially lost through the disease. And it manifests itself. So that's the physical symptoms, or that the brain tissue is affected. Now, the cognitive and mental symptoms that you have this disease include things like, very stereotypically, people think of the memory loss, like someone with Alzheimer's doesn't recognize family members. But it goes much further than that. They lose the ability to take care of themselves, for example. So they lose ability to take care of basic hygiene. In fact, they even seem to forget how to swallow their food, and all kinds of horrible degenerative onward effects. There's emotional effects as well that are observed. So all of these things are what you observe, supposedly from someone whose brain has this disease. And what they found in this nun study is that even though people physically have the symptoms of Alzheimer's in their brains, cognitively, they didn't show any signs of Alzheimer's at all while they were alive and functioning. And this is really interesting that this happened. So one of the things that they think, or what the findings are, is that the brain can develop a mechanism that it can accomplish tasks in more than one way. So in other words, neuronal pathways can be activated, not just the way they always go, but you can find like a backup route through the brain. Does anyone catch the term that David Eagleman gave for this ability of the brain to find a new pathway to use, or a different pathway to accomplish the same task?
Was it cognitive reserve?
Yeah. So Si-Cheng wrote it, Maya said it, cognitive reserve. So this is an important concept. And the study has tried to look at ways to develop your cognitive reserve, or things that might help you achieve this. Did anyone catch any of the suggestions they had that the nuns seemed to be doing that helped them increase their cognitive reserve?
Well, they remain like cognitively active. So like they often, like for example, some of them like play scribbles, and some of them teach like kids. And yeah, so like they keep on using their mind, so their brain shouldn't, like, it slows down the process of degenerating.
Yeah, so one thing they did was they constantly were activating their minds through different things. So one of them played Ruzzle, I don't know, on her phone, and others taught. Some of them relied on prayer. Other things that have been identified include things like exercise and diet are influential, supposedly, in helping to maintain cognitive reserve through your lifetime. And although it doesn't necessarily stop a degenerative disease, it probably slows its process, as if you do develop a cognitive disease, your cognitive reserve can help it have a less of an influence on your emotional and cognitive health, or the appearance of that in your life. Really interesting study. So we're getting to the kind of the last parts of this, which deal with identity and self, which of course is the big theme of this class, although I think all of these things are related. Memory is related. How your brain health affects your behaviors and your beliefs and your emotions and your interactions is of course related to self. But there's also the idea of what is the self, the sense of self. So that's pretty cool. So I'm going to pause again. We're going to get to the video. So here we go. Hi, can everyone hear me again? Yeah, awesome. All right, let me just check one thing. Sydney, are you going to be okay doing your presentation in the next class?
Yeah, sure. I just wasn't sure that was available at the time.
It is now.
Okay.
Because I'm just not going to get to it because I want to just pause on this. We're almost done with the video. So, because we have like 10 minutes left and I don't want you to rush and I want people to pay attention and, you know. So, what am I going to say? So one of the things David Eagleman next looks at, of course, is the sense of consciousness, that you are an individual who considers like, I'm a me, right? So he looks at how neural firing in the brain creates a sense of self. And in particular, he showed you this using like research with like an EEG, which is an EEG, which is used to measure like brain activity. So when he went to sleep, he could show you different stages of sleep. And there's a certain stage of sleep where you're your brain is there. It's not that it's dead, but there's no longer a sense of you. What happens in the brain when there's no longer really a sense of you or that you exist? or what part of sleep might we call it? We can even just begin with that.
It's the deep sleep.
Yeah, so when you're in deep sleep, that's when you're no longer conscious. And what is the brain doing when you are in a state of deep sleep?
And like the signals are more like uniform and synchronous.
Yes, and synchronous. Those are two great words to use. So when you're in deep sleep, your brain's neurons fire in very regular patterns. They're firing, so they're happening, but it's very synchronous. It's very like a drum beat. It's very steady and rhythmic. Now, what's very interesting about the different stages of sleep, this was when I was an undergraduate, I took a class on brain and behavior, and the teacher, the professor, he was like a sleep researcher. And I always tell the story, like his advice was like, don't do sleep research. It's terrible. He's like, you have to stay up when everyone else is asleep and you're just watching people sleep and they don't do very much. It's not like interesting to watch. Nonetheless, that was his expertise. But in the different stages of sleep, the neural firing is very different. So in what is known as delta sleep, I think is the deep sleep. In beta sleep, that's dreaming sleep. So the neurons are firing, but they're not, I think I might have messed up the order, but the neurons are firing, but it's not as, why do I think I've got that wrong? Pretty sure delta sleep is deep. Anyway, it doesn't matter what the titles are, but in the dream sleep, the neurons are firing, but it's more irregular than when you are wakeful and conscious. Like it's sort of like being awake, but not quite awake. There's irregularities. And then when you're conscious, the firing is different patterns of firing are happening. So the neurons firing, it's not chaos, but it's not as regular and ordered as in deep sleep. So it's those patterns of firing happening over and over and over again, billions of times per second, that kind of gives you a sense that you exist and of all the things around you, which is kind of crazy. And of course, when you die, your brain is still there. You still have neurons, but your consciousness is gone. And that's because the relationship between those different firing patterns has stopped in the brain. Very interesting stuff. And again, this is the neuroscientific perspective on kind of what makes the self and what makes you is the firing patterns and the relationship between those patterns in your brain. The very last thing he's going to talk about, of course, is the idea of meaning. And he was starting to show you something. And he asked a question. And I would love for us to take a moment to just, if you have your camera off, if you could put it on, that would be great. We'll just do a little hands up or hands down. So how many people would answer the question about pigments on a cloth as having meaning? How many people think that pigments put on a cloth could have a meaning for them? How many people do? How many people think it would never have a meaning for you to put pigments on a cloth? Nobody? How many people just don't want to answer because they just don't know? And like, what is this intense question that Professor Levine is asking? So the reason, what imbues things with meaning is obviously an unanswered question. He's going to make that point, but I'm just going to let the video play out so you can see how he addresses that. So let's get this up. Got to make the screen small. There's many steps I have to follow to do. And there we are. So he ends by looking at meaning and how for each of us we develop our own associations of meaning to the things around us. And I think what's important that he says there is we don't perceive things as they are, but rather sort of how we interpret them, or we give our own spin on things. And that's very important. If you think about pretty much any illusion, your eye is seeing the illusion, but your brain is interpreting it in its own unique way. So I hope that, I hope you enjoyed the movie. So in the next class, we'll be talking about the brain. Some of this stuff you will probably know from psychology. It might be a little bit of a refresher. Some of it's a little bit of history, just kind of the history of neuroscience. If you did the brain reading, I think it's called A Disordered Mind. Well, the book is called A Disordered Mind. It's all about, there we go, what brain disorders can tell us about ourselves. So this particular, thank you, Jordan. So this particular book is really fantastic. It's actually a really great book, but it looks at different brain disorders and how it shows us how the brain functions and works. It's by looking at atypical people that there's an understanding of what different regions in the brain and what they do. So just kind of for fun for the next class, maybe you've heard of some brain regions before. You've been exposed to a few already from this class, things like hippocampus, medial prefrontal cortex, amygdala. Maybe you have a favorite part of the brain that you have heard of. And in the next class, I'm going to ask the question, what is your favorite part of the brain? And we'll hear from some people maybe what their favorite brain part is. So maybe look up some stuff if you don't have one or don't know one, and we'll see what people have to say. I think it'll be an interesting question to lead off our next class. So other than that, I hope you all have a lovely few days, and I'll see you guys on Thursday morning. See you then. Bye. Bye. I get to work on that class marker thing. Bye.
Hi, Miss. I just have a question.
Yeah, of course. Let me pause the recording then.